Hello, I'm going to talk to you about the issue of suspending puberty blockers that happened in Queensland a week ago. I'm from an organisation called Sex and Gender Education Australia, SAGE. We're involved in political campaigning and the rights and dignity of people who are sex and gender diverse. People who are intersex, transexed, transsexual, transgender, gender diverse, sex non-specific, and so on. We had a discussion at SAGE between the people involved, and we decided to look at it and make public comment. I've taken a week to digest the information and think about it very carefully, because everybody's chipping in, giving an opinion, often without the right information. At the end of January, well, in January itself, somebody called Kiri Smith has an organisation called Binary, and they got together 100 people that they describe as prominent to write a letter complaining about the standards of care for trans children, that somehow there was something wrong with them and there needed to be a national inquiry and possibly shut down. This letter circulated and became public. And now the first thing to consider is, I can't really see any prominent specialist in sex and gender diversity of those 100 people. So basically, regardless of their profession, they seem to have opinions that are outside that speciality field. At the end of January, the Minister for Health in Queensland, who is Tim Nicholls, who used to be the head of the Liberal Party in Queensland, announced a ban on puberty blockers and hormones for people under 18 in Queensland. Apparently there was some inquiry about a clinic in Cairns, and that they weren't getting bone scans back on time, etc. But I can't see any major problems that have occurred in care in Queensland. These are small incidents that can be helped. Clinicians can be helped to provide better service with support from the health minister themselves. But the ban affects other providers within the government health system in Queensland. So it seems to be motivated by something else than keeping those children safe. A few days later, the federal health minister, Australian federal health minister, Mark Butler, he announced a national review for puberty blockers and hormones for children under 18, or youth under 18, teenagers under 18, who were receiving care. And this seems to be driven by the letter from the Binary Association. But the Queensland situation seems to be driven by the Liberals Party desire to be in Parliament instead of Labour. At the moment, the Liberal Party and the Nationals are positioning themselves to do a repeat of Donald Trump's success for his second presidency in America. It's obvious their policies are going that way. They're trying to appeal to the right wing. This comes off the back in Australia of Trump's executive orders, where he said, you can't treat trans people, trans children, trans youth, they can't be in sport, and so on. All sorts of prejudice, ignorant statements. that itself came off on top of a situation in England where the Tavistock Clinic became in the limelight and was really pillared in the press. And there was a review in England by a Dr. Hilary Cass, and it was to review the gender identity services for minors. And everybody who is anti-care for people under 18 seems to be resting on this review. But the review is incredibly faulty. I'm a researcher and I've looked at the review, and there are major problems with it. First of all, it suffers from selective bias. It only looks at certain factors. It's not really consulted with community, with people who experience sex and gender diversity and their opinions. So it doesn't go out into community. It also has a very selective literature review. So it's the source of the information is incredibly biased. One of the things about the ban in England and the ban in America and now the ban in Queensland here is that it's against the advice of professionals. I'm not saying specialists in the field. I'm actually saying general professionals, and I'll give you a list of them. British Medical Council, Royal College of Psychiatry, British Psychological Society, British Counselling and Psychotherapy Association, American Medical Association, American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, and so on and so on. But when we come to Australia, it also comes against the policies and the opinions of the Australian Medical Association, the Australian Psychological Association, and the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia. So the professionals themselves do not see that there needs to be a banning of treatment for people under 18, whilst perhaps a review is held. But also the specialist field, there's the cry that there's no proper standards of care, but standards of care throughout the world are generally set by the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and also in consultation with the intersex community. In Australia, we have AusPath, so that's the Australian Professional Association of Transgender Health. So we have two bodies, an international body and an Australian body, who recommend standards for professionals in that specialist field. Also, as specialists in that field, we're also monitored within our special fields. So we have to belong to the associations for the field that we're in, endocrinology, psychology, psychiatry, etc. So surgery. So we're constantly monitored on many levels. And we have to receive supervision. So we have to constantly review the work that we do. So the standards of care have been set over about 40 years. And they've evolved and evolved and evolved. And they used to be a lot different from that as they are now. But I want you to be aware what this ban in Queensland means. First of all, the Queensland ban contravenes international human rights law, the right to medical treatment without prejudice. Now, no other sector in Australia has had their medical treatment withdrawn. Only this particular sector of youth who are sex and gender diverse, particularly notified as trans or gender diverse. The Federal Marriage Act because the Federal Marriage Act says that people after 16 can get married in the identities they choose. However, if you take away someone's medication and their ability to identify in the way that they believe they are, in the way that's comfortable for them, mentally and physically, that means they can't marry in the identity that they themselves associate to be. It's a breach of the Freedom of Travel Act, the Passport Act, because it means that the passport that they may get may not coordinate with the physical identity that they are presenting as, because they haven't had the help of puberty blockers and hormones. So if they're going into countries that are difficult, it can be terribly hard for them. They can be detained at customs, there can be suspicion about their identity, etc. The right to an education, and this is very controversial, that many schools are trying to reject trans children and to subdue them and tell them you cannot present in the identity that your clinicians tell you agree with you that you are. But it leaves them exposed to harassment and bullying in school, because if you're not getting the medication and the help that you need, you can't acclimatize to the other school children and to the education system. The right to work. Now, we have this law in Australia that you leave school when you're 18, but in reality, many people do work experience from 16 onwards. And some people literally do part-time work when they get to 16 years old. So they need to be able to identify in the work situation as the sex and gender that they are comfortable with, that is right for them. And they're unable to do that if they're not getting the help that they need. So this ban on puberty blockers and hormones transgresses all those guidelines and all those laws. What it also does is create a black market for those puberty blockers and hormones. This exists in China, in Russia, in many countries in the world. Young people can go on the internet, on the black web, they can buy them and get them posted to them. If they're taken to another country, they can buy those over the counter, or someone can smuggle them into the country for them to buy, or to help them, because they're not available on the Medicare services in Queensland, on the government health care services. The very idea this wouldn't happen is pure fallacy. Because as a clinician, I see young people coming into clinic, as well as older people, who have been taking illegal hormones for years and being medically unmonitored, which is so dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous. In fact, at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Associate Professor Michelle Telfer also reported that she sees young people coming into clinic who are taking illegal hormones. So why you think that people aren't going to get hold of these medications by the back door is beyond me. It's delusional. And those complications that can occur can be blood clots, they can be bone problems, they can be severe acne, they can be liver problems, or really problems that can cause difficulties for life, because they're not being medically monitored. As well as being a clinician, I'm also a trans and an intersex woman. And at 15, back in London, 55 years ago, I bought hormones on the street in Soho, on the Soho corner. I bought them off the street because the clinicians would not prescribe them. And I was desperate. For me, not to have those was so difficult for me. It led to 3 suicide attempts during my period from 14 to 18 years old, when clinics kept rejecting me and kept not giving me the medications that I need. And there are thousands of people throughout the world in different countries who experienced the same thing at that time, but still do the same thing today. It's always best to keep people in clinic so you can help them there and then. Make services available to them, not shut them out. I'm very short-sighted. I want to come back to standards of care because, it takes a long time to create standards of care. And it can take years of consultation as each version of those standards of care come up, not only within WPATH, but also with OSPATH. It's not just somebody sits down and writes them out. It takes a long time and discussion amongst clinicians and consulting research to come to those conclusions. The right wing would like you to think that suddenly all these people under 18 are going into clinics and becoming the opposite sex or gender by Friday. This is not correct. It is ignorant. It takes many years to go through a process of evolution and transition, and there has to be checks and balances along the way by psychological practitioners, by endocrinologists, to take care that the person is coping with their life and handling the situation. Suicide. This is a big one. I'm the author of intersex and trans suicide book, Guide for Healthcare Professionals. So this is a field I spent years researching and that I've been exposed to in clinic really over 50 years when I've been working with different groups in different countries. The figures are that young people run a 70% risk of suicidal thoughts when they can't get the medical help that they need so they can transition comfortably. And it's repeatedly, many studies say 40, 50%, one study says 70%. But if we look at the literature, we see there is a cross section of results from research that tells us the risk is so high because of minority stress. And there's lots of people out there posting, oh, trans people not of right mind, they're disturbed, they're autistic. Well, some are autistic, but not many that really, and even if they were, even if you have a mental illness, that doesn't necessarily deny you care, because assessment is done to see if you can handle the situation. But the history of treating people under 18 goes back to 1987 with Professor Louis Geuren, the endocrinologist, and Peggy Cohen-Ketteris in Holland, who was professor of psychology. And at the time they started to see people and people transitioned. And I bumped into these clinicians at conferences over the years. And I remember a presentation that Peggy Cohen-Ketteris did back in the 90s. And she reviewed her records. And what she found was that many people who had been rejected from the clinic as minors came back into clinic later as young adults, very, very angry and depressed because they'd been rejected from having treatment. And the kind of mental problems, anxiety, trauma, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder that occurs when someone is rejected from having treatment can actually last for life. It can be totally and completely devastating. For some people, it means they will never work. For some people, it means they will spend the whole of their life on welfare because they're not functional. And that's not because they're gender diverse or sex diverse or trans or whatever. That's generally because of minority stress, of the bullying, the ridicule, the harassment, the violence, the rejection. What this ban also does is that it contravenes Australia's Sex Discrimination Act. Because the Sex Discrimination Act determines you cannot discriminate against people on the grounds of gender, which includes people who are gender diverse. But this is what the ban does. Now, it's generally considered that 80% of treating children for cancer is usually an 80% success rate, but it's a 20% failure rate. But there's no ban for that treatment. There's never been a ban for that treatment. Clinicians and patients are never harassed for that 20% failure. It's seen as an evolving science, an evolving field. But in this field of sex and gender diversity, there is a very high success rate, and that's above 80%. In adults, it's around 90 to 95%. And in youth, it's well over 80%. Now, of course, there are clinicians that do make mistakes. There are clinicians out there who are not properly trained and not experienced, who are putting themselves forward to treat people who are sex and gender diverse. And that is a problem. We're not going to deny it's a problem, but it has to be an evolving field. And the government's saying there has to be a national standard. This is an ever-evolving field. A national standard one year is not going to be the national standard next year because it's completely evolved. So in Australia, we have two systems. We have a system where they go along and the clinicians say, yes, you are suitable for this treatment. And the other system is, I would like this treatment. And if I'm under 18, my parents support me and the family comes in, etc., or my guardian supports me. We have two systems in Australia. And we have that because the clinician making the decision has proved to be quite disastrous in some cases because they get it wrong, because they're not the person and they're not listening to the actual patient themselves. But it is an evolving field. And we have to allow the field to continually evolve and for people to continually receive treatment. Because if it doesn't, the field doesn't grow. Australia has been a leader in the field at times in the 90s, the Anti-Discrimination Act, then it fell behind, then we had the Sex Discrimination Act changed in the about 15 years ago, which put us again ahead. But this has put us way behind. It's put treatment for people under 18 a long way behind. And let me tell you what those people face. They face bullying at school. They face social ostracization. They face harassment on the internet. Sometimes they face belligerent parents who do not want them to transition, tell them that they're wrong, and interfere with treatment. Legally, that's a parent's right to a certain extent. But when it makes a child suicidal, that's not right. They face medical professionals who don't know what they're doing. If you're a young person transitioning and you go to an emergency ward, you're going to be faced with people who know nothing about your experience. And that can be very daunting for them, particularly if you haven't had the puberty blockers and the hormones. You may not want to go to the emergency ward. And many intersex and trans people avoid seeking medical help because they're faced with ignorance and sometimes prejudice as well from medical professionals. So this ban is a contravention of human rights in Queensland. It's also cruel. I'm going to say it again. It's also cruel, and it doesn't further the field or protect those young people. It actually puts those young people in danger, considerable danger, and it needs to be lifted as soon as possible because it's damaging those young people severely. As long as they cannot get the puberty blockers that they need and the hormones that they need, and generally they don't get hormones until 16 years old, but the puberty blockers need to come in when they're reaching puberty, because if they're natal male on the birth certificate and the associate is female, then they don't want to go through a male puberty. It can be quite devastating for them. Or if they're registered female, they don't want to go through that female puberty because they're identifying as male. And it's important to listen to the patient themselves. And this ban is not listening to the patient group. It's driven by political desire to be right. So those of you out there who are the parents of those children in Queensland, please reach out and bring a case against the Queensland government, because this is criminal negligence on their part. It is criminal abuse of those children. Go forward in peace. Bye-bye.